Welcome, dear listener. This is Adam's Scary Stories. Tonight we're exploring bone-chilling encounters from truck drivers who traveled the loneliest highways. The kind of roads where the darkness moves and the silence listens. So before we begin, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the night take over. From this point on, the words you'll hear are not mine. They belong to the drivers who lived these moments. Let's begin. I've been driving the Dalton Highway for 19 years, and in all that time I've learned to read the road like a book written in ice and stone. I know every stretch, every danger, every peculiar bend that tries to claim the unprepared. It was November of 2023, and I was pushing a full load of oil field equipment from Fairbanks toward Deadhorse, a grueling 414-mile journey that would take me through the loneliest parts of Alaska. My Peterbilt was running smooth, the engine purring despite the cold that had already dropped to minus 38 degrees. I'd been on the road since 4 in the morning, and it was now nearly midnight. The endless darkness of November pressed down on me like a physical weight. There were no other vehicles on the road, hadn't been for the last 2 hours. Just me, my truck, and the vast emptiness of the north. I'd picked up my coffee at the Coldfoot truck stop around mile marker 170, and I'd noticed something off even then. The usually bustling stop was quiet, almost abandoned. Only the old man at the counter, Jimmy, who always complained about his knees, seemed to be working. I'd asked if business was slow, and Jimmy had given me a strange look, then said nothing, just poured the coffee and took my money. I should have thought more about that look, but I was tired and eager to make good time before the weather turned worse. The radio had predicted a system moving in from the north, nothing catastrophic, but enough to make the drive more difficult. I'd decided to push through. By mile marker 160, I'd settled into the familiar rhythm of long-haul driving. The road behind me was empty, stretching back into the black void. Ahead, my headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the road and the occasional frost-covered stone. The Dalton this far north was a stark, unforgiving place. No settlements for over 100 miles in either direction. No cell service, no help if something went wrong. I'd made this drive so many times that the isolation didn't bother me anymore. I was comfortable with my own thoughts, comfortable with the rhythm of the engine, comfortable with the knowledge that I was one of the very few people crazy enough to be out here on a night like this. Then I saw her. She was standing at mile marker 164, right on the edge of the shoulder, just beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked hard, focused on the road ahead, and looked again. She was still there, a woman standing motionless in the cold, wearing what looked like a black dress that hung loosely from her frame. Her hair was long and dark, and her face was pale, turned toward the road but not quite looking at my truck. My heart rate picked up. There was nothing at mile marker 164. Nothing for 50 miles in either direction but empty tundra. I eased off the accelerator, my mind racing through possibilities. A stranded driver, but where was her vehicle? A hiker from some distant point. Impossible. The nearest settlement behind me was Coldfoot, over 90 miles back. The nearest settlement ahead was Livingood, still over 100 miles away. And no one hiked the Dalton in November. The temperature alone would kill someone in hours. As my truck slowed and drew closer, I got a better look at her. She was definitely a woman, tall and thin, with her arms hanging at her sides. Her dress looked like it was from another era, something you'd see in an old photograph, long and flowing and completely inappropriate for the Arctic cold. There was something deeply wrong about the image of her standing there, illuminated by my headlights, utterly still and utterly alone on the frozen highway. I brought the truck almost to a stop. I should have kept driving. Later, I would wish 1,000 times that I had. But my instinct was to help, to check if someone needed assistance. I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires, and came to a complete halt about 20 yards away from where she stood. I left the engine running, the heater blasting warm air, and stared at her through the windshield. She hadn't moved. She was still facing the road, still completely motionless, her arms still hanging at her sides. In the glare of my headlights, I could see that her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes seemed to be fixed on something in the distance. She didn't react to my truck at all, didn't turn her head or acknowledge my presence in any way. I felt a strange sensation creeping up my spine, a primordial warning system that something was fundamentally wrong about this situation. But I was a help-minded person, and someone was clearly in distress. I grabbed my heavy jacket from the passenger seat, put on my gloves, and stepped down from the cab. The cold hit me instantly, sucking the breath from my lungs. -38 was brutal, and the wind coming down from the north made it feel even worse. My breath came out in thick clouds of white vapor. I left the truck running and walked toward the woman, my boots crunching on the icy gravel. "Hey there," I called out, my voice sounding thin and strange in the vast silence. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't turn her head, didn't blink, didn't give any indication that she'd even heard me. I was about 10 feet away now, close enough to see more details. Her dress was definitely old, the fabric rough and worn. Her feet were bare, impossibly bare in this cold. Her toenails were blue. She wasn't shivering, wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything that a living person exposed to -38-degree weather should be doing. Her face, when I could see it in profile, was expressionless, empty. "Hello, can you hear me?" I stepped closer, my concern turning into something else, apprehension, fear. "What are you doing out here? Where's your car?" The woman turned her head slowly toward me, very slowly. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like old film footage. Her eyes fixed on mine, and I felt my blood go cold. Her eyes were wrong. The pupils were dilated so wide that they looked almost entirely black, and there was no reflection in them. Nothing. They were like looking into empty wells. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice soft and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I've been waiting so long for someone to find me." My mouth went dry. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "I don't remember anymore," she said. "I remember the cold. I remember standing here. I remember watching the road, but I don't remember my name. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to run, to get back to the truck, to drive away as fast as I could. But I was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from those terrible empty eyes." "How long have you been standing here?" "Time doesn't work the same way here," she whispered. "How long has it been for you?" I realized I didn't know. I tried to remember what time I'd seen her first. Had it been 5 minutes ago? 10? 20? I looked at my watch. It said 12:15. I was sure it had been midnight when I first saw her. That was only 15 minutes, but it felt like longer. It felt like I'd been talking to this woman for an hour. "I need to go," I heard myself say. "I need to get back to my truck." "No," she said, and suddenly her hand reached out and grabbed my arm. Her fingers were ice cold, so cold they burned through my jacket. "You can't leave. I need you to take me with you. I need you to take me to Dead Horse. I've been waiting for someone to take me there." I jerked my arm away from her grip. There was no strength in her hand, but the touch of her skin was so cold that it hurt. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the ice. "Stay away from me." The woman's face twisted into an expression of anguish. "Please," she called out as I turned and started walking quickly back toward my truck. "Please, you have to take me. I've been waiting so long. 19 years I've been waiting at this spot. 19 years watching the trucks go by. Please don't leave me here alone." I didn't respond. I reached my truck, climbed into the cab, and immediately put it in gear. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if she was still standing there or if she was chasing me. I just pushed the accelerator and felt the truck lurch forward onto the highway. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the wheel. In my mirror, illuminated by the taillights of my truck, I saw her still standing on the shoulder, her arm raised as if reaching toward me. For the next hour, I drove in a state of heightened panic. Every shadow on the road looked like a figure. Every sound in the truck made me jump. I kept checking my mirror, half expecting to see her climbing onto the bed of my truck or appearing in the darkness behind me. My radio, which I usually left on the CB channel for traffic reports and friendly conversation, started picking up static. Lots of static. And then, faintly, beneath the static, I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, and it was saying my name. "Marcus," the voice said. "Marcus, please, I'm still here, I'm still waiting. You left me alone again." I shut off the radio, but I could still hear it. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere now. From the wind outside, from the spaces between the sounds of the engine. Every few minutes I heard her calling my name, each time sounding more desperate, more anguished. I made it to Dead Horse at 3 in the morning, 8 hours after I should have if I'd maintained normal speed. The truck stop there was closed and I couldn't find anyone to talk to about what I'd experienced. I fueled up at the automatic pumps and sat in my cab for 2 hours, unable to sleep, unable to move. When dawn finally broke around 10 in the morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going back the way I came. Instead, I called a colleague in Fairbanks and asked if someone could pick up the backhaul. Then I flew out on the first plane heading south. I never drove the Dalton Highway again. I transferred to southern routes, took a pay cut, and didn't care. I couldn't face the thought of seeing that woman again, of hearing her voice in the darkness, of having her reach for me with her impossibly cold hand. Years have passed now and I'm retired. I live in Anchorage, far from the north. I don't talk about that night much anymore, but sometimes late at night when the wind picks up, I hear that voice again very faintly, calling my name from a great distance. And I wonder if the woman is still standing at mile marker 164, still waiting for someone to take her to Dead Horse, still watching the trucks go by in the endless night. I sometimes catch myself looking at news reports from the Dalton Highway, searching for stories of drivers going missing, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone else has picked her up and she's finally able to rest. But I don't really believe that. I think she's still there, unchanged and unchanging, waiting in the cold forever. I've been hauling freight across the Yukon Territory for 22 years, and I've always prided myself on being the kind of man who helps when I see someone in need. It was in my nature, hardwired into me by my upbringing. My father had been a rescue worker, and I grew up with the understanding that when you saw someone in trouble, you didn't look away. You stopped, you helped, you did whatever you could. So when I came around a bend on the Dempster Highway in the early morning hours of October in 2024 and saw a dog limping at the side of the road, bloody and clearly in distress, I immediately started slowing my truck. The Dempster was an 886-kilometer stretch through the Yukon that ran from Dawson City to Inuvik. It was remote, beautiful, and utterly merciless if something went wrong. I'd driven it hundreds of times, knew every kilometer marker, every dangerous curve, every spot where the permafrost was unstable. But I'd never seen a dog this far north, this far from any settlement. The animal was medium-sized, maybe a husky or a Malamute mix with dark fur matted with blood. One of its back legs was clearly injured, hanging useless as the dog struggled to move. I brought my truck to a stop about 30 yards away and climbed down from the cab. The morning was cold, around -15 degrees, and the sun hadn't quite broken the horizon yet. The sky was a deep blue gray and the landscape around us was stark and empty. Just rocks and sparse vegetation and the endless tundra stretching away to nothing. The dog looked at me with desperate eyes. "Easy, buddy," I called out, making my voice soft and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you, let me help you." The dog tried to back away, but its injured leg wouldn't support it and it stumbled. It whimpered, a sound that cut right through my heart. I approached slowly, moving at an angle so as not to seem threatening. The dog didn't bite or growl, just watched me with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The eyes seemed too intelligent, too aware, too focused. There, I said, kneeling down slowly. "Where did you come from, boy? How did you get all the way out here?" The dog's breathing was rapid and shallow. Its fur was warm under my hands, which meant it hadn't been lying on the road for long. The wound on its back leg looked fresh, raw, and infected. It needed veterinary care immediately. There was a small settlement at Fort McPherson, about 80 kilometers north. It was the nearest place that might have someone who could help. I made a quick decision. I picked the dog up carefully, trying not to jostle the injured leg, and carried it to my cab. The dog didn't resist. It just looked at me with those strange, intense eyes and made a low, almost grateful sound. I got it settled in the passenger seat, wrapping it in an old blanket I kept in the cab for emergencies. The dog rested its head against the window and closed its eyes. I radioed ahead to the truck stop at Fort McPherson, explained the situation to the dispatcher, and was directed to an indigenous elder named Sarah who lived in the community and was known to help animals. Without hesitation, I pointed my truck north and pushed the accelerator. The drive should have taken about 2 hours. It should have been straightforward, a routine stretch of highway through familiar territory. But something felt off to me within the first 30 minutes. The road seemed longer than it should be. I'd pass a kilometer marker, then wait for the next one, only to realize that what should have taken 5 minutes had taken 20. The landscape outside never seemed to change much. It was the same rocks, the same sparse vegetation, the same empty tundra, and the sun, which should have been rising as I drove north, seemed to be staying in the same position on the horizon. The dog, meanwhile, had stopped moving entirely. It was perfectly still, barely breathing. I could feel the cold of its body, colder than any living body should be. I reached over to check if the dog was still alive, to feel for a pulse or signs of breathing. Yes, it was breathing, barely, each breath shallow and labored. But something was deeply wrong. The dog's eyes were open now, fixed on the road ahead, and they seemed to glow faintly in the dimness of the cab. I drove faster. There was a sense of urgency rising in me, a feeling that something was very wrong and that I needed to get help as soon as possible. The radio chatter that I'd been monitoring started to become unclear, cutting in and out, the voices distorted and sometimes speaking in languages I didn't recognize. I turned it off and drove in silence except for the rumble of my engine. Then I saw the town. Fort McPherson should be just ahead, kilometers away, still based on the markers, but suddenly there was a collection of buildings visible in the distance, and I recognized the silhouette of the settlement. But something was wrong about the way it looked. The buildings seemed too far away and too close at the same time, shifting and changing as I drove toward them. The colors were washed out and strange, grays and pale blues where there should have been the warm colors of lights and painted structures. I drove faster, desperate to reach it, desperate to find Sarah and help this dog. The settlement seemed to get closer, then farther, then closer again. The road beneath my wheels felt unstable, like it was shifting under me. I could hear a sound now, a low humming that seemed to be coming from the ground itself or from the air around me. It made my teeth ache. The dog suddenly convulsed. Its body went rigid and it let out a sound that was part whimper, part howl, a sound that I'd never heard an animal make before. It was a sound of pain and something else, something that sounded almost like sorrow. I reached over to comfort it, but when I touched the dog's side, I felt that it was burning hot, impossibly hot, and also covered in a layer of slime or mucus that hadn't been there before. "Hang on, buddy," I whispered, my own voice sounding strange in my ears. "We're almost there. We're going to get you help." The dog turned its head toward me and I saw that its eyes had changed. They were still glowing now, visibly glowing with a pale blue light. And there was something in the dog's gaze that wasn't entirely animal anymore. There was intelligence there, something ancient and wrong and utterly inhuman. The settlement ahead suddenly disappeared. One moment it was visible in the distance, and the next there was just empty highway stretching into the horizon. I hit the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The dog let out another of those terrible sounds, and then it simply stopped breathing. I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. The dog was dead, and its body was already cold, colder than anything dead should be so quickly. I sat in my truck, staring at the corpse of the dog on the passenger seat, unable to process what was happening. I should have been at Fort McPherson 5 hours ago. I checked the kilometer markers. I'd been driving north on the Dempster for what felt like 2 hours. But according to the markers, I'd somehow traveled backward. I was south of where I'd found the dog, moving back toward Dawson City, and I had no memory of turning around or changing direction. The radio came alive suddenly, filled with static, and then a voice. It was Sarah's voice, the elder I'd been trying to reach. But it sounded wrong, distorted, like it was being broadcast from very far away or from underground. "Don't bring it here," Sarah's voice said, filled with an urgency that was almost desperate. "Please don't bring it here. It isn't an animal. It was never an animal. Leave it on the road. Leave it where you found it." I tried to respond, but my voice wouldn't work. My throat felt sealed, my lungs frozen. The dog's body began to change. Its fur started to fade, becoming translucent, and underneath I could see something that wasn't quite flesh. It was something geometrical and angular and impossible, something that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could properly see. The smell coming from the corpse was indescribable, a mixture of ozone and ancient things and corruption. I threw open the passenger door and stumbled out of the cab. I couldn't look at what the dog had become. I couldn't process it. My mind was fragmenting under the stress of it. I stood on the shoulder of the highway, gasping for breath, and realized that the landscape around me had changed again. I wasn't on the Dempster anymore. I was on a road I didn't recognize, in a place that didn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. The sky above me was a color that had no name, a shade that made my eyes hurt to look at. I ran. I got back to my truck, left the door open, left the dog's remains where they were, and drove. I drove south as fast as the truck would go, watching in my mirror to see if anything was following me. The kilometers seemed to pass in a blur, and gradually the landscape began to look more normal. The sky returned to its proper color. The sun resumed its proper position. The road beneath me became solid and real again. I made it back to Dawson City, sick and shaking. I didn't report what had happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I filed a report about finding a dead animal on the highway and disposing of it. I went to the truck stop, had coffee, and tried to calm my nerves, but I couldn't drive the Dempster again. The road had somehow changed for me, somehow become a place where things that shouldn't exist could exist. I transferred to different routes, but the horror of that morning never left me. Sometimes in the middle of the night I would hear that sound again, the awful howl whimper that the thing in my truck had made. And I would wonder what would have happened if I'd managed to bring it to Fort McPherson, if I'd succeeded in bringing it to Sarah. I retired early, moved to British Columbia, and refused to talk to anyone about what had happened in the Yukon. But the memory stayed with me, vivid and terrible. And sometimes when I see a dog on the street or hear an animal cry out in pain, I remember that moment of compassion, that decision to stop and help. And I wonder if that creature had been counting on my kindness all along, waiting on that remote stretch of highway for a good-hearted man to come along and pick it up. I'd logged over 25 years driving long haul, and in all that time I'd learned to trust my instincts. My instincts had kept me alive through blizzards, mechanical failures, and encounters with other drivers who weren't entirely right in the head. So when I felt the creeping sense of dread starting in the pit of my stomach on that December evening in 2024, I paid attention. I was heading south on the Richardson Highway from Fairbanks, making the run toward Anchorage with a load of supplies. It was around 6 o'clock in the evening, the kind of time when the darkness was complete and absolute, a few weeks before the winter solstice when the world barely saw daylight at all. My truck was a Kenworth, well-maintained and reliable. The heating system was working perfectly, keeping the cab warm despite the temperatures outside having dropped to minus 42 degrees. My cargo was secured properly, my lights were all working, and I had a full tank of fuel with another 150 kilometers to the next truck stop. By all objective measures, everything was fine. But there was something wrong, something that existed beneath the level of conscious thought, but which my mind kept trying to warn me about. I'd stopped at the Coldfoot truck stop around 2 in the afternoon, grabbed a meal and a cup of coffee, and had spent about 30 minutes in conversation with other drivers. Most of them were heading the opposite direction, going north toward Deadhorse for the oil work. One driver, a younger guy named Steve, had seemed worried about something. When I asked him what was up, Steve had hesitated, then said something about seeing shadows on the road. Dark shadows that moved on their own, that didn't seem to match the shadows of his truck or anything else. Steve said he'd been driving at night and had seen these shadows dancing across his windshield and the road in front of him. They had seemed to move independently of any light source. When he'd tried to chase them with his headlights, they'd dispersed, but then they'd come back a few minutes later. Steve said he'd eventually pulled over and waited for daylight before continuing. I'd dismissed it at the time as exhaustion or the effects of long hours on the road affecting someone's perception. But now, as I drove through the darkness, I kept thinking about that conversation. And then I saw them. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, a shadow crossing my windshield that didn't correspond to anything outside the truck. I blinked and looked more carefully. The road ahead was clear, illuminated by my headlights. The truck's interior was well lit by the dashboard. But there was definitely a shadow there, a deep black silhouette that seemed to be moving across the glass from right to left. I slowed down and watched more carefully. The shadow moved again, this time from left to right, darting across my field of vision like something alive and deliberate. My hands tightened on the wheel. I was being rational about it, trying to come up with logical explanations. Perhaps there was something on the exterior of the windshield, maybe a bird flying close to the glass. Perhaps my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. Perhaps the reflections from my headlights were creating illusions. But none of those explanations felt right. The shadow moved too deliberately, too purposefully, for it to be a random occurrence. Then I looked in my mirror. The shadow was there too, visible against the darkness outside my truck, moving across the landscape behind me. It was a dark shape, roughly human-shaped, but not quite right, the proportions slightly off. And it was keeping pace with my truck. I accelerated, the shadow accelerated. I slowed, The shadow slowed. It was matching my speed exactly, maintaining a constant distance behind me. I pushed the accelerator harder, watching the speedometer climb. I was doing 90 kilometers an hour now, pushing the limits of what was safe on a highway in the darkness. The shadow was still there, still keeping pace, still moving with an eerie uniformity that suggested intelligence and purpose. My heart rate was climbing now, my breathing becoming rapid and shallow. I reached for the radio, thinking I might call the dispatcher or try to reach another trucker on the CB. But when I turned it on, there was only static. Not the normal static between channels, but a thick, overwhelming wall of sound that seemed to fill the cab and make my teeth ache. I turned it off quickly. The shadow was still there. Now there were more of them. I could see two distinct shapes moving across the landscape behind me, keeping pace with my truck. They were moving in a coordinated way, as if they were hunting, as if they were working together to track me. My mouth went dry. I pressed the accelerator all the way to the floor. The truck surged forward, the engine roaring. I was doing over 100 kilometers an hour now, much too fast for the darkness and the icy road conditions, but I didn't care. I could see the shadows in my mirror, and they weren't falling back. They were keeping pace, their movements becoming faster, more frantic, more aggressive. They seemed to be trying to get closer to the truck, to reach it, to catch it. I saw a truck stop ahead, lights blazing in the darkness. It was right there, just a few hundred meters away. I was heading straight for it, and as I got closer, I could see that it was lit up and functional. Thank God, I thought. I could make it there, could stop and figure out what was happening. Maybe other people had seen these things, maybe someone could explain what was going on. But as I approached, pulling into the parking lot and heading for the pumps, something went wrong. The truck stop flickered. For just a moment, I saw it as it really was, a burnt-out husk of a building with windows that were dark and broken and pumps that were bent and rusted, clearly abandoned for years. Then the image returned to normal, the lights blazing again, the place looking perfectly functional and real. I didn't stop. I couldn't explain why, but something in that moment of seeing what was underneath the illusion told me that the truck stop wasn't real. I drove through the parking lot without slowing and continued south on the highway. In my mirror, I could see the truck stop fading into the darkness behind me, and I could see the shadows now spreading across the pavement in the parking lot, dozens of them, moving in circles and patterns, almost as if they were celebrating my escape. For the next 2 hours, I drove without stopping, without turning on any lights except my headlights and my running lights. The shadows stayed with me, sometimes there, sometimes seeming to disperse, always reappearing after a few minutes of reprieve. They followed me through the darkness, keeping pace, their movements becoming less coordinated and more frantic as the night wore on. I could almost feel their frustration, could almost perceive an intention to harm or capture me. I pushed the truck faster and faster, reckless in my speed, but I didn't care. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, I saw the lights of Glenallen ahead. A real town, with real lights, with real people. As I approached and the lights got brighter, the shadows seemed to retreat. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, they were gone completely. I pulled into a truck stop parking lot, shut off the engine, and sat in the silence of my cab for a long time, shaking. I got out of the truck and looked around. The parking lot was normal, with other trucks parked in their spaces, the lights of the truck stopped blazing warm and welcoming. But when I looked at the road behind me, I could see shadows moving in the darkness beyond the reach of the lights. They were staying at the edge of the illuminated area, not coming closer but not leaving either. Watching. I went inside the truck stop and found the manager, an older man named Paul. I asked him about the shadows, about what I might have seen on the Richardson Highway. Paul's face went pale. He told me to sit down to have some coffee, and then he told me that I wasn't the first person to report this. Over the past few months, there had been at least 5 truckers who'd come in with similar stories. Shadows that moved on their own. Shadows that followed. Shadows that seemed to hunt. One driver, Paul said, had been so terrified that he'd abandoned his truck on the highway and hitchhiked the rest of the way. Another had claimed that the shadows had actually touched his truck, leaving dark marks on the exterior that wouldn't wash off. And another had stopped here, had coffee like I was doing now, had spent the night in the truck stop and then had decided to continue south at first light. That driver had never made it to his destination. His truck had been found 2 days later parked on the side of the highway, the interior empty. No signs of what had happened to him. I listened to all of this and felt the last remaining shreds of my rationality dissolving. These weren't hallucinations. Other people had seen them. These things were real, or at least real enough that they were affecting multiple drivers. Paul told me that the safest thing to do was to wait until daylight. The shadows, according to the other drivers, only appeared at night. In daylight, they were absent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the truck stop drinking coffee and talking to Paul, listening to stories about other drivers and other encounters. At 3 in the morning, I stood at the window and looked out at the road behind the truck stop. The shadows were still there at the very edge of the light from the building, moving in slow, lazy circles. Waiting. When dawn came around 9 in the morning, the shadows were gone. I got back in my truck and drove. I made it to Anchorage without incident, but I never drove the Richardson Highway again after that night. I transferred to routes in the lower 48, took a significant pay cut and refused all offers to return to Alaska. The memory of those shadows, of that sense of being hunted, never left me. Sometimes, even now when I'm driving at night and I see a shadow move in my peripheral vision, my hands tighten on the wheel and my breathing becomes rapid. And I wonder if the shadows were unique to that road, or if they're everywhere, just waiting for the right conditions, just waiting for a driver to be tired enough or desperate enough to venture out into the darkness alone. I've never taken the risk of finding out. I'm 57 years old and have been driving trucks for 31 years, making me one of the oldest active drivers on the Dalton Highway. I've seen changes come and go, have witnessed the oil boom and the slow decline, have made enough money to retire comfortably but couldn't quite bring myself to stop driving. There was something about the road, something about the isolation and the challenge of it that kept me coming back. So in September of 2024, I found myself heading north on the Dalton again, pushing a load of drilling equipment toward Deadhorse. It was late afternoon when I started the run from Fairbanks. The weather was clear, the road conditions were good, and I'd made this trip dozens of times before. I'd stopped at Coldfoot to fuel up and grab some food and had chatted with a couple of other drivers who were heading south. Everyone seemed in decent spirits and there were no warnings or concerns being discussed. The road was open, the conditions were manageable, and it looked like it would be a straightforward drive north. But around midnight, when I was about halfway between Coldfoot and Deadhorse, somewhere in the vicinity of mile marker 250, something felt different about the night. The darkness seemed deeper, more absolute than I was used to. My headlights didn't seem to be cutting through it the way they normally did. The road in front of me appeared distant and unclear, as if I was looking at it through a pane of smoked glass. I slowed down a bit, trying to get a better sense of the road conditions. Visibility was fine, I told myself. It was just the late hour and the darkness making things seem strange. Then I saw the lights ahead. 2 sets of headlights clearly visible in the distance, approaching from the north. Trucks. Big rigs by the look of the spacing between the lights. I expected to see them fairly quickly given the speed they seemed to be traveling at, but the distance between them and my truck didn't seem to be closing. They stayed far ahead, their headlights clearly visible but not getting any closer. I was confused. On the Dalton, you usually see oncoming traffic fairly regularly, especially the large convoy trucks that run supplies. But the normal protocol was to acknowledge each other on the CB radio. I switched to the common frequency and tried to raise them. "Northbound convoy, this is Raymond in a Peterbilt heading north with drilling equipment. What's your status?" There was no response, just the gentle hiss of an open channel. I waited a moment and tried again. "Hello, anyone on this channel? Northbound convoy, please respond." Still nothing. The headlights were still there, still maintaining that strange constant distance, neither getting closer nor falling back. I felt a flutter of unease in my chest. Something wasn't right. On an impulse, I checked my speedometer. I was doing 85 kilometers an hour, a reasonable speed for the conditions. I looked at the lights again and tried to estimate their speed. They were moving faster than me, I was sure of it, at least 90 or 100 kilometers an hour. But they weren't closing the distance. I pressed the accelerator. I brought my truck up to 95 kilometers an hour. The lights ahead remained at the same distance. I pushed harder, getting up to 110 kilometers an hour, well above what was safe for night driving on the Dalton. The lights were still there, still the same distance away. It was as if they were being maintained at exactly the same distance from me, no matter what speed I drove. A thought occurred to me that made my blood run cold. What if they weren't approaching me at all? What if I was approaching them? What if I'd somehow missed them, or they'd been parked or something and now I was chasing them? But that didn't make sense either, because if I was approaching them at a higher speed, the distance should be closing. Unless they were accelerating at exactly the same rate I was, exactly maintaining their distance. I tried the radio again. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? I'm seeing your headlights ahead, but I can't raise you on the radio. Please respond." This time there was an answer, but it wasn't a normal radio transmission. The voice that came through was distorted and strange, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once but somehow synchronized. It said something that I couldn't quite make out, a garbled sentence that sounded like it was being spoken in reverse or underwater. Then it cut out. My hands were shaking now. I slowed my truck down, bringing the speed back to a reasonable level. The lights ahead didn't change. They stayed at exactly the same distance, didn't take the opportunity to pull away despite being faster. I looked for a side road or pull-off where I could stop and figure out what was happening, but the Dalton at this point was just road, stretching through the darkness with nothing but tundra on either side. I tried the radio once more. "This is Raymond Hutchins, and I'm trying to make contact with the vehicles ahead of me. I'm not sure what's happening here, but I need some kind of communication." There was a longer silence this time. Then the distorted voice came back, and this time I could almost make out what it was saying. It was saying my name. Over and over, the layered voice was chanting my name. "Raymond, Raymond, Raymond, Raymond Hutchins, Raymond Hutchins, Raymond Hutchins." On and on, the voice repeating my name with a cadence that seemed almost hypnotic. I shut off the radio. I couldn't listen to that anymore. The sound of my own name, distorted and strange, repeated by that impossible voice, was making my mind feel fractured. I drove in silence, watching the headlights ahead continue to maintain their distance. After what felt like hours, but what my clock said was only 45 minutes, I decided to try something different. I pulled onto the shoulder and came to a complete stop. I watched as the lights ahead immediately started to fade. They became dimmer and dimmer until they were barely visible against the darkness. Then they disappeared completely. The road ahead was empty. I sat in my truck, engine running, heater working, trying to calm my racing heart. I was still on the Dalton Highway. I was still alive. I still had plenty of fuel. The road was still open, but the convoy was gone, and I was left wondering if I'd ever really seen it at all. I decided to continue driving. I'd push through the rest of the night and reach Deadhorse before dawn. As I pulled back onto the highway and accelerated, I looked in my mirror one more time. Far behind me, at a distance that seemed impossible given my speed, 2 sets of headlights appeared. They were heading south now, back the way they'd come, and they were maintaining a consistent distance behind me, exactly matching my speed, staying in my mirror no matter how fast or slow I drove. I didn't look at the mirror again after that. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and drove as fast as I could safely go. The lights stayed in my mirror for another 30 minutes, and then sometime around 3 in the morning they disappeared. I reached Deadhorse without further incident and delivered my load without anyone being the wiser about what I'd experienced. But the experience had shaken me profoundly. I arranged to be picked up by another driver for the journey south instead of making the return journey myself. I flew back to Fairbanks and took a month off. When I finally returned to driving, it was only on the routes in the lower 48. I never drove the Dalton Highway again. Sometimes I would lie awake at night and wonder about that convoy, about what it was and where it had come from. I wondered if the drivers had been real people or something else entirely. I wondered if I'd somehow been caught in a temporal loop, chasing vehicles that didn't exist in my current time, vehicles that belonged to a past that had somehow bled through into the present. I'm old now, nearing 80, and I haven't driven a truck in years. I live quietly and speak very little about my decades on the road. But occasionally, when someone asks me about my most terrifying experience, I'll tell them about the convoy on the Dalton Highway, about the headlights that maintained an impossible distance, about the distorted voice calling my name. I'll tell them about the experience that convinced me that there are phenomena in the north that have no rational explanation, that exist in the spaces between what we understand and what we refuse to believe. I'm 48 years old and have been driving ice roads and remote highways for 19 years. I'm a capable, experienced trucker with a solid reputation and a perfect safety record. I'm the kind of driver other drivers respect, the kind who doesn't take unnecessary risks and who is always prepared for emergency situations. So when I took the Dempster Highway on that February morning in 2025, I thought I was embarking on another routine run, another straightforward drive from Dawson City toward Inuvik with a load of supplies. The Dempster in February was cold, brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to minus 55 degrees at night and barely getting above minus 40 during the day. The sun was starting to come back after the deep darkness of January, but it was still spending most of its time below the horizon. I had all the right equipment, proper winterized fuel, extra blankets, emergency supplies, and a radio system that was in perfect working order. By every measure, I was prepared for the drive. I left Dawson City at 8 in the morning and made good time for the first few hours. The road was clear, though icy, and traffic was sparse, as it always was on this stretch. I was making excellent progress, and I calculated that I'd be in Inuvik well before nightfall. Around kilometer 400, which should have put me roughly halfway through the journey, I noticed something that made me start paying attention to details. I'd passed kilometer 398 about 10 minutes earlier. Then I'd driven what should have been a straightforward stretch to kilometer 400. It should have taken about 10 minutes at my current speed. But when I looked at my odometer and the kilometer marker ahead, I saw that I was still at kilometer 399. Somehow, in the 10 minutes of driving, I'd only traveled 1 kilometer. I frowned and checked my speedometer. I was doing a steady 80 kilometers an hour, maintaining a good pace. I figured it was just a reading error or something off with the kilometer markers. The Dempster had been upgraded over the years, but not everywhere, and sometimes the markers didn't reflect exact distances. I drove on, keeping an eye on my progress. After what I calculated should be another 5 minutes at my current speed, I checked the markers again. I was still at kilometer 399. I slowed down to get a better look at the kilometer marker. It clearly read 399. I accelerated again to my normal driving speed and watched my odometer carefully. According to my odometer, I drove for another 20 minutes. By my calculations, at 80 kilometers an hour, I should have covered nearly 27 kilometers. But when I checked the next kilometer marker, it still read 399. My heart started beating faster. I was experiencing some kind of localized anomaly, something that was preventing me from making forward progress in the normal sense. This was extremely unusual and more than a little unnerving. I tried to think of logical explanations. Perhaps the odometer was broken. Perhaps I was actually driving much slower than my speedometer indicated. Perhaps the kilometer markers were all wrong, but none of these explanations felt satisfactory. I decided to use my radio and report the situation to dispatch. I explained that I seemed to be having trouble making progress on the Dempster between kilometer 399 and kilometer 400, and that I wanted to report it in case there was a road issue that other drivers should be aware of. The dispatcher's response was confused. He said that according to the road maintenance records, there was no issue between those kilometer markers and that several other trucks had passed through that area earlier without reporting any problems. "Are you saying you're stuck at the same kilometer marker?" the dispatcher asked. "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied. "I've been driving steadily for almost an hour and I haven't moved past kilometer 399. There was a pause on the other end. Then the dispatcher said, "I want you to look at your fuel gauge and tell me how much fuel you have." I glanced at the gauge. It read the same as it had when I'd left Dawson City, a full tank. "I'm full, same as when I started." "And your engine is running normally?" the dispatcher asked. "No indication of mechanical problems?" "No, everything is running perfectly," I said. "I don't understand what's happening here." The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that he was going to contact some of the other drivers who'd been on the Dempster to see if they'd noticed anything unusual. I waited, listening to the static on the radio, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The landscape around me was white and empty, the Arctic tundra stretching away to nothing on all sides. There were no other vehicles visible, no signs of civilization, nothing but ice and snow and the road stretching forward and behind me. After several minutes, the dispatcher came back on the line. He said that he'd contacted 2 other drivers and both of them said they'd passed through kilometer 399 without any issue. One of them said they'd passed it less than an hour before I reported my problem. The dispatcher suggested that perhaps my odometer was malfunctioning and that I should continue driving as if everything was normal. I wanted to argue, but I wasn't sure what I would argue about. I agreed to keep driving and to check in with dispatch every 30 minutes. I continued on, watching the landscape pass by, watching my speedometer and the road in front of me. Everything seemed normal. I was making good speed, the truck was running fine, and I should have been making progress. But kilometer 399 never appeared on any of my markers. Instead, I started seeing kilometer markers that didn't make sense. After driving for what seemed like a long time, I saw kilometer 250. Then, a few minutes later, kilometer 500. Then kilometer 150. The markers were random and illogical, as if the road was folding in on itself or as if I was simultaneously on different stretches of the Dempster at the same time. I tried to remain calm, but my voice on the radio was shaking. I reported what I was seeing to the dispatcher. The dispatcher, who seemed thoroughly confused at this point, told me to find a safe place to pull over and wait. A rescue team was being organized. I was to stay in my truck, stay warm, and wait for help. I found a wider shoulder about 20 minutes later, though by my calculations based on driving time and speed, I should have covered well over 30 kilometers. I pulled over and shut off the engine, leaving it running just enough to keep the heat on. I settled in to wait, and around 2 hours later, another truck came up behind me. It was driven by a man named Derek, an old friend of mine who'd been contacted by dispatch and asked to check on me. Derek pulled up beside my truck and we both got out and talked briefly in the cold. Derek said that he'd been driving on the Dempster all day without any issues, and that he didn't understand what I was describing. He'd passed kilometer 399 multiple times throughout the day without problem. Derek offered to let me ride with him for a while to get away from the truck and see if being a passenger changed anything. We got in Derek's truck, and Derek continued south toward Inuvik. I watched the kilometer markers carefully. With Derek driving, we passed kilometer 399, and the markers continued to advance normally. 398, 397, 396. Everything was fine. I started to feel foolish. Had I been experiencing some kind of psychological episode? Had the isolation and the cold affected me somehow? But then Derek asked me a question that made me go cold. Derek asked me what day it was. I told him it was February 25th. Derek said, "It's February 27th. Where have you been for 2 days?" I checked my watch. It said the 25th. But Derek's watch and the clock on the dashboard of Derek's truck both said the 27th. Somehow, in my truck with all of my instruments reporting consistency, I had lost 2 full days. I'd been driving for what I perceived as about 8 hours, and I'd been missing for 48 hours. We drove together to Inuvik, and I didn't report the incident to anyone. I couldn't explain it, and I knew no one would believe me anyway. I took a flight back to Dawson City a few days later and quit driving the Dempster. I took a position driving routes in the southern provinces, and I never drove that stretch of the Dempster Highway again. I'm still driving today, but I'm a changed man. I'm much quieter than I used to be, and there's a wariness about me that wasn't there before. Whenever I talk about that day on the Dempster, my voice gets distant, and I seem to lose track of time as I'm talking, as if part of my mind never left that frozen highway. I'm 60 years old and have been driving the ice roads since I was 22. I've seen trucks broken down in the middle of nowhere, have seen drivers make terrible mistakes that cost them their lives, and have seen phenomena on the roads that I couldn't quite explain, but that I've learned to accept as part of the territory. I'm tough, pragmatic, and not easily rattled. I've heard all the ghost stories and the paranormal accounts, and I've generally dismissed them as the products of tired minds and too much time alone on the road. So when I came around a corner on the Dalton Highway in December of 2024 and saw an old truck parked on the side of the road, abandoned and listing to one side, my first instinct was practical rather than fearful. A truck had broken down. This happened. Someone might need help, or at least I could report the location to authorities so it could be dealt with properly. I pulled over in front of the abandoned vehicle and examined it more carefully. It was a Peterbilt, probably 30 or 40 years old, with faded paint and panels that had been damaged and then repaired multiple times. The truck was tilted because the driver's side was sitting in a small depression, and the right side tires had lost air pressure over time. I could see into the cab from where I stood, and it was empty. The steering wheel was visible, along with some old cloth seats that had been torn and worn by decades of use. I looked around for any signs of the driver, any indication of what had happened. The landscape around them was barren, just rocks and tundra stretching away in all directions. There were no other vehicles, no signs of recent activity, no indication of where the driver might have gone. I checked the truck's doors and found them all locked. I tried to see if there was any identifying information, any papers or registration that might tell me when the truck had been abandoned. But I couldn't see anything through the windows clearly enough. I went back to my truck and called dispatch. I gave them a description of the abandoned vehicle and asked them to contact authorities to come collect it or at least file a report. The dispatcher took the information and said they'd get someone out there to check on it when they could. In the meantime, I was advised to continue on my way. I was about to do exactly that when something about the truck nagged at me. I went back and looked at it one more time. As I did, I realized something that made me stop and look more carefully. The truck's exterior was extremely weathered. The paint wasn't just faded, it was deeply etched by weathering, suggesting that the truck had been sitting in the elements for a very long time. Years at least, possibly decades. The tires were completely deflated, not just partially flat, and they looked like they'd been that way for so long that the rubber was starting to decompose. Grass was growing up around the base of the truck. Dirt and dust had accumulated on the surfaces. This truck hadn't been abandoned recently. It looked like it had been sitting here for at least 10 or 20 years, possibly longer. I looked at my GPS and saw that I was at approximately mile marker 190. I made a note of it and continued on my way. It was strange, but not necessarily dangerous. I'd come back later or report it further up the line. When I got to Dead Horse and parked at the truck stop, I asked some of the other drivers if they'd ever seen an old abandoned Peterbilt around mile marker 190. Several of them said no, they'd never seen anything like that. One driver, a woman named Susan, said that she drove the Dalton regularly and that she'd never seen any abandoned truck at that location. I thought this was strange because the truck was definitely there, and it was definitely old and definitely abandoned. I asked the truck stop manager if there had been any reports in recent memory of old vehicles being abandoned on the Dalton. The manager said that he'd been in Dead Horse for 15 years and had never heard of any such incident. I described the truck to him in detail, and the manager became thoughtful. He said that there had been a story a long time ago about a truck that had broken down at mile marker 190. This had been in the 60s, the manager said, back when the Dalton was first being developed. A driver had reported engine problems and had called for a tow. But when the tow truck arrived, the disabled vehicle was gone. They never found it, and it became something of a legend among the old-time drivers. Some of them joked that it was a ghost truck, a phantom that appeared occasionally but disappeared when you tried to get help. I didn't like the sound of that. I finished my business in Dead Horse and headed back south, planning to stop at the same location and get a closer look at the truck, maybe get some photos this time that I could show people. But when I reached mile marker 190, there was nothing there. The spot where the truck had been was empty. Just tundra and rocks and nothing else. I double-checked the marker, made sure I was at the right location, and looked around carefully. The truck was definitely gone. I reported this to dispatch and received a response that was polite but skeptical. The dispatcher said that no other drivers had reported seeing an abandoned truck at that location, and that it was possible I had been confused about my location or my memory of the incident. I knew this wasn't true, but I didn't push the matter. Over the next few months, I found myself thinking about that truck. It bothered me in a way that I couldn't quite articulate. I'd seen something that was physically real when I saw it, that I could describe in detail, that other people confirmed had some basis in historical reality. But it had vanished, and now nobody seemed to believe it had been there. I found myself wondering if I'd been experiencing some kind of hallucination, or if there was something about that location on the Dalton that was playing tricks on people's perceptions. I continued to drive, but I never stopped again at mile marker 190. I passed it regularly after that initial incident, always looking to see if the truck had reappeared, but it never did. Sometimes I thought I could see something there at the edge of my vision, a shape that might have been a truck. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing but empty tundra. I eventually retired from truck driving, but the memory of that truck never left me. I still wonder sometimes if it's still there, existing in some state that most people can't perceive, waiting for another driver to see it and perhaps to stop and investigate more thoroughly than I had. I wonder if anyone will find it again, or if it will remain a phantom, appearing and disappearing, a mystery that the road refuses to let go. I'm 38 years old and have been driving the Arctic routes for 12 years. I'm relatively young for a long-haul driver, fit and strong with excellent reflexes and a good head on my shoulders. I transferred to Alaska from the lower 48 because I wanted to experience the challenge of driving in extreme conditions, and I've never regretted the decision. I've become skilled at navigating ice roads and dealing with mechanical problems in remote locations. I considered myself fearless, or at least I did, until one night in January of 2025 changed that assessment. I was heading south on the Dalton from Deadhorse, making the long drive toward Fairbanks with a load of oil field equipment. It was around 3 a.m, that dead hour when the darkness was absolute and the world seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, and I knew it well. The road was clear of other traffic and conditions were normal. I was cruising at a steady pace, listening to old music on my driver's playlist, when I saw something move on the road ahead. It was just a glimpse, a shadow that darted across my headlights. My first thought was that it was an animal, perhaps a moose or a caribou. It wasn't uncommon to see large animals on the Dalton, and they could be a hazard. I slowed down and looked more carefully, but there was nothing there. The road ahead was clear and empty. I accelerated again, assuming it had been a trick of the eye, but then I saw it again, this time more clearly. It was on the right side of the road, and it was moving parallel to my truck. It was a shape, four-legged, but something about it was wrong. Its proportions were off. Its legs were too long, its body too slim. Its head was moving in a way that didn't seem natural, swiveling with a motion that suggested intelligence and curiosity. I'd never seen an animal move quite like that. The thing seemed to be pacing me, keeping up with my truck's speed. I accelerated to 100 kilometers an hour. The creature accelerated with me. I pushed the truck up to 110. The creature matched my speed effortlessly, maintaining the same distance on the right side of the road. I could see it more clearly now, and the more I saw, the more deeply unsettled I became. It was bipedal, I realized. It was standing on 2 legs, not 4. What I'd thought were the movements of a 4-legged animal were actually the movements of a 2-legged being that was just very tall and very thin. Its arms, if they could be called that, were long and hung down almost to the ground. Its head was small in proportion to its body, and it seemed to be covered in fur or hair that looked matted and dark. I jerked my truck toward the right, toward where the creature was running, my instinct to hit it, to neutralize the threat. But as my truck started to veer toward the shoulder, the creature seemed to leap up and away, and suddenly it was on top of the truck. I heard the sound of something heavy landing on the cargo bed, could hear it scuttling across the metal roof of the cab. I screamed and jerked the wheel back toward the center of the road. I was doing 120 kilometers an hour now, far too fast for the conditions, but I was operating on pure terror and instinct. The thing on the roof started to scrape and claw. I could hear its nails or claws or whatever appendages it had dragging against the metal, making horrible screeching sounds. Then I heard the windshield crack. A long line appeared across the glass, and I realized that the creature was trying to get through into the cab with me. I pushed the accelerator all the way to the floor. The truck surged forward, reaching 130 kilometers an hour, approaching the speed limit of what the vehicle was capable of sustaining. The clawing and scraping on the roof intensified, became frenzied. I was screaming now as well, my hands locked on the steering wheel, my eyes wide. I couldn't think clearly, couldn't plan, could only react. The windshield cracked further, more lines appearing across the glass. Something dark and horrible was starting to press through from the other side. Then I hit something on the road. A rock, a piece of debris, something that was just barely large enough to affect the truck's trajectory. The front tire caught it and the whole truck lurched to the right. I lost control. The truck went off the road and started to roll. I heard the creature shriek, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard, a sound that combined fury and pain and something else that I couldn't name. The truck flipped, metal screaming, and came to rest on its side in the ditch at the edge of the road. I was stunned and hurt, but alive. I could hear the hiss of escaping fuel and air, the creaking of damaged metal. I could hear nothing else. The creature was gone. I waited for several minutes, listening, terrified that it might try to attack again. But there was only silence. I managed to crawl out of the truck despite my injuries. I was bleeding from several cuts and believed I'd broken at least one rib. I sat on the cold ground beside my destroyed truck and waited. Around sunrise, another truck came along and found me. The driver called for help and I was eventually evacuated by helicopter to Fairbanks for medical treatment. The authorities investigated the accident and found the truck wrapped around a rock on the side of the road. They found no signs of any animal, no tracks, no evidence of anything other than me losing control. The truck bed was empty except for the cargo, and my descriptions of what I'd seen and encountered were met with skepticism and medical concern. The doctors suggested that I might have experienced a psychological episode brought on by exhaustion and the stress of driving in remote areas. I survived my injuries and was eventually discharged from the hospital. But I never drove again. I left Alaska and moved to Florida, where I took a job in an office that paid a fraction of what I'd been making as a trucker. I couldn't explain to anyone what I'd seen, couldn't convince anyone that it was real. But I knew what it was. I'd seen it with my own eyes, had felt it on my truck, had heard its terrible voice. And I would never be willing to take the risk of encountering it again. I'm 54 years old and have been driving long haul for 28 years. I'm experienced, reliable, and have built a reputation as someone who can handle difficult situations without panic. I'm not superstitious, don't believe in ghosts or curses or supernatural phenomena. I believe in facts, in mechanics, in things I can see and touch and understand. So when I was driving the Richardson Highway south of Fairbanks on an evening in March of 2025, I was confident in my ability to handle whatever the road might throw at me. I was about 50 kilometers south of Fairbanks when I first noticed something odd with the CB radio. The static seemed deeper than usual, more omnipresent. And underneath the static I could hear what sounded like voices, but they were distorted and impossible to make out. I adjusted the frequency, assuming I'd accidentally tuned to a local channel instead of the highway channel. But when I tried different frequencies, I found the same thing. Voices underneath the static on every channel. I switched the radio off and drove in silence for a while. When I switched it back on, curious to see if the phenomenon had cleared, I found that the voices were even more pronounced now. In fact, as I listened more carefully, I realized that the voices seemed to be calling out locations, names of places, routes, highways. Dalton, I heard. Yukon. Dempster. And then most chillingly, I heard my own route. Richardson. I switched the radio off again. This was starting to creep me out and I didn't like it. I decided that the radio must be malfunctioning in some way and that I'd get it checked at the next truck stop. For now, I'd just drive without it. I'd been driving long enough that I didn't really need it. I knew the routes, knew the landmarks, knew what to expect. But then I saw the text on my dashboard. My truck had a modern communication system and it showed text messages and alerts. A message had appeared on the screen. "Do not continue south on the Richardson, turn back now." I frowned. I didn't recognize the sender and the message didn't make any sense. Who would send me such a warning? I pressed a button to dismiss the message and continued driving. A few moments later, another message appeared. "Warning, do not continue south. Please turn back immediately." I stopped the truck at a safe location and checked the system. The messages were coming from a number that my truck's system didn't recognize. It wasn't registered in my contacts, and when I tried to reply, the system rejected the action. I didn't like this at all. This felt like either a technical glitch or someone playing a prank, and neither option was particularly appealing when I was alone on a highway in the darkness. I restarted the communication system and deleted the messages. I checked my fuel level, verified that everything else was in order, and continued driving. The warning messages started appearing again, about 5 minutes later. This time there were multiple messages, all with the same content. "Do not continue, turn back, danger, do not continue." My irritation was growing, but so was a subtle sense of unease. This was not normal. Technology glitches, yes, but not in a pattern like this. Someone or something was deliberately sending me these warnings. I picked up my phone to call dispatch and report the malfunction, but my phone had no signal. Out here on the Richardson, that wasn't unusual, but it was typical to have at least occasional signal. I drove on, trying to ignore the constant stream of warning messages that continued to pop up on my dashboard. I decided that I would just turn off the communication system entirely and drive the rest of the way in silence. I reached down to shut off the system, and as I did, every screen in my cab suddenly lit up at once. My dashboard, my communication system, even my headlights seemed to flicker with light. A voice came through the radio, which I'd turned off. A woman's voice, clear and strong and filled with urgency. "Michael Thornton, this is dispatch. Do not continue south on the Richardson Highway. Multiple accidents reported. Road is closed. Turn back immediately." My blood ran cold. The voice sounded real, sounded official, sounded like it could be an actual dispatcher. But there was something wrong about it too. The voice didn't sound quite like any real dispatcher I'd ever heard. It sounded slightly artificial, slightly off in a way I couldn't quite define. "Michael Thornton," the voice continued. "Turn back now. This is not a drill." I made a split-second decision. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and tried the radio again, looking for a signal. This time, when I switched it on, I got a normal channel, with normal static and no distorted voices. I raised dispatch and reported the malfunction in my communication system. The dispatcher on the other end, a man's voice this time, responded that there were no road closures on the Richardson, no accidents reported, and no reason for me to turn back. The dispatcher said that multiple trucks had passed through that area in the last few hours without incident. I verified my location and checked the time. It was around 11 at night, and I still had about 4 hours of driving to get to my destination. I decided to trust the official dispatch rather than the warnings from my malfunctioning system. I continued driving south. For the next hour, everything seemed normal. The messages had stopped appearing on my dashboard. The radio was quiet. I was starting to feel foolish about my earlier fear. I was halfway to my destination when I saw the first accident. It was a truck, stopped on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. It looked like it might have had a mechanical issue. I slowed down as I approached, ready to pull over and see if the driver needed help. But as I got closer, I realized that the truck was empty. The cab was dark, the doors were open, and there was no one inside. I looked around for signs of the driver but saw no one. My unease returned, but I was a practical man. The driver had probably walked down the road or gotten a ride with another truck. I continued on, but a few kilometers later I saw another abandoned truck, and then another. 3 trucks, all parked on the side of the road, all empty, all with their hazard lights flashing. My hands were shaking on the wheel now. I tried to reach dispatch again, but there was no signal. I tried my CB radio, but I only got static. I tried my communication system, but it was completely dark and unresponsive. I was alone on a dark highway with no way to communicate, surrounded by abandoned trucks that shouldn't be there. I made the decision that the warnings had been right. Something was wrong with this road, something that I didn't understand and didn't want to understand. I turned my truck around and headed back north toward Fairbanks. I watched in my mirrors as the abandoned trucks receded into the darkness behind me. When I passed the point where I'd first seen them and looked back, they were no longer visible. I made it back to Fairbanks and reported the abandoned trucks to authorities, providing exact locations. The authorities went to investigate but found nothing. No abandoned trucks, no signs that any vehicles had been disabled or left on the road. The locations I specified were checked multiple times and they were always empty. I took a mandatory wellness break after that incident. I saw a therapist, got my truck thoroughly inspected by mechanics, and verified that all my communication systems were functioning normally. But I never drove the Richardson Highway again. I transferred to other routes and eventually retired. To this day, I refuse to explain exactly what happened on that stretch of road, and I become visibly distressed if anyone tries to press me for details. But others know to listen to me when I tell them that there are places on the northern roads where warnings, whether they come from official sources or mysterious ones, should be heeded. I'm 62 years old and have been driving in the Arctic for 34 years. I'm one of the oldest active drivers on the northern routes, a man who's seen the industry change and evolve, but who's always adapted. I'm tough in the way that only long-haul Arctic drivers can be tough, weathered by decades of cold and isolation and challenging conditions. I believed I'd seen everything the North had to throw at me. I was wrong. It was October of 2024, just before the deep winter set in. I was driving on a route that ran through the Yukon Territory, moving through an area where the permafrost was particularly active. The ground in this region was unstable, subject to sudden collapses and shifts when the frozen layers beneath the surface started to thaw, or when the ice lenses within the permafrost adjusted. This particular route had been built and then rebuilt several times over the decades because of these ground stability issues. I was acutely aware of these hazards. I'd been driving long enough to have a healthy respect for what the ground could do. I was careful about my speed, paid attention to the road conditions, and knew what warning signs to look for. As I drove, I was noticing that the road seemed a bit soft in places, that the asphalt was showing signs of stress and cracking. This was normal for this region in the fall, as the top layer of permafrost started to adjust to the changing temperatures. I was driving carefully, maintaining a moderate speed. Then I felt it. The truck lurched suddenly to the left as if one of the tires had hit a pothole. I gripped the wheel and tried to steady the vehicle, but then the left side of the truck started to sink. Slowly but definitely, I could feel the driver's side of the truck starting to drop. The steering wheel moved in my hands as the suspension geometry changed. I immediately brought the truck to a stop. I could feel that the left side was definitely lower than the right side now. I looked out the window and saw that the ground on the left side of the truck had collapsed inward, creating a depression that the truck's tires had partially sunk into. This was permafrost collapse, the kind of hazard that I'd dealt with before but that never got any less frightening. I carefully eased the truck forward, trying to get it out of the depression. The truck lurched as the left tires found purchase and started to climb out of the hole. But as the truck moved forward, I felt a different kind of movement. The ground beneath the right side of the truck had given way. Now the truck was tilting the other direction. I pressed the accelerator, trying to get the truck completely onto solid ground. But the situation was getting worse, not better. The truck lurched again, a violent movement that threw me around in the cab. When I looked out the window, I realized what had happened. The entire width of the road had collapsed beneath me. The truck was now in a massive sinkhole, and it was continuing to sink. I could see the edges of the hole crumbling, could see the asphalt breaking apart, could see the permafrost beneath the road starting to shift and flow. My survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed my emergency kit, my communication device, and the heavy winter clothing I always kept in the cab. I undid my seatbelt and prepared to get out of the truck. But as I moved toward the door, the truck lurched again, and this time it tilted dramatically. I realized that the sinkhole was deeper than I'd initially thought, and that the truck was falling into it. The truck went nose first into the opening, and I felt a stomach-lurching sensation of falling. I heard the sound of metal screaming, heard the crash as the truck hit the bottom of the collapse. I was thrown forward, hit my head on the steering wheel, and lost consciousness momentarily. When I came to, the cab was tilted at a steep angle, and I could see that the truck had broken through the top layer of permafrost and was now partially embedded in the layer beneath. I pulled myself up with my hands, trying to assess the situation. The truck was at least 15 feet below the surface level of the road, trapped in what appeared to be an underground cavern formed by the permafrost. Above me, I could see the opening where the truck had fallen through, and I could see light from outside filtering down. I grabbed my emergency kit and my communication device and tried to contact dispatch. There was no signal. I was underground, surrounded by permafrost, with no way to call for help. I looked around and tried to figure out how to climb out of the truck and make it to the surface. The truck's door was jammed by the angle of the vehicle and the debris surrounding it. I had to climb out through the window. As I was pulling myself up toward the window, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The walls of the cavern around me were not just ice. They contained things. I could see what looked like ancient wood, pieces of a structure that had been preserved in the permafrost for who knew how long. And there were bones, large bones, too large to be from any normal animal. And mixed in with the ice and ancient remains, I could see what looked like objects. Tools maybe, or implements of some kind, also preserved perfectly by the cold. I didn't wait to examine these discoveries more closely. I hauled myself out the window and started climbing toward the opening above me. The permafrost was slick and difficult to climb, and my feet kept slipping. But I was strong and determined, and I made it to the surface after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes. Once above ground, I took stock of the situation. The road had a massive hole in it, 15 feet deep at least. My truck was at the bottom, probably damaged beyond repair. There was no one else around, no other vehicles, no way to get help except by my communication device, which still had no signal. I started walking along the road, searching for a spot where I might get a signal. After walking for about 30 minutes, my communication device suddenly came alive. I immediately called dispatch and reported my situation. A rescue operation was organized, and within several hours, a rescue team arrived at the location. They assessed the situation and concluded that I'd been incredibly lucky to survive the fall and to escape the collapsed sinkhole without serious injury. But when the rescue team investigated the cavern where my truck had fallen, they found no trace of the objects I'd described. No ancient wood, no large bones, no mysterious implements. The walls of the cavern were pure permafrost, exactly as they should be. The rescue team expressed doubt that I could have seen what I claimed to have seen. They suggested that the stress and shock of the accident might have affected my perception. I knew what I'd seen. I'd seen preserved remains, ancient structures, things that didn't belong in a modern highway's permafrost layer. But I couldn't convince anyone else. My truck was recovered, and I was given time off to recuperate from the accident. But when I returned to driving, I found that I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in that cavern. I couldn't stop wondering what lay preserved in the permafrost of the north. What ancient secrets the ground was keeping. I retired about 6 months after the accident. I'd had enough. I moved to a small town in British Columbia and tried to leave the northern roads behind. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself on the internet, looking at geological surveys of the Yukon and the Alaska regions. I'm searching for information about the permafrost, about what it contains, about whether anyone else has discovered evidence of the ancient structures and remains that I saw preserved in the ground beneath the highway. I've never found anything definitive, but I'm convinced that something is down there. Something that the modern world doesn't know about. Something that the permafrost is keeping safe and hidden until the day when someone else falls deep enough to see it. I'm 59 years old and have been driving the Dalton Highway for 20 years. I'm calm, methodical, and not easily rattled by the challenges that the northern roads present. I've always prided myself on my reliability, my consistency, and my ability to solve problems without panic. My record is perfect, my safety record spotless, and I've been offered promotions multiple times, all of which I've declined because I preferred to keep driving. So when I took an evening run heading south from Deadhorse on a clear night in January of 2025, I was expecting nothing more than a normal drive. I'd maintained a steady pace through the early evening hours, making good time and checking my fuel situation carefully. I knew the fuel stops on the Dalton, knew exactly where I needed to refuel to make it to the next stop, and was planning to fuel up at a small truck stop that I knew existed around mile marker 150. It wasn't much, just a fuel station with a small building where drivers could get coffee and use the bathroom, but it was reliable, and I'd stopped there dozens of times. I reached the expected location of the truck stop around 8 at night. But there was nothing there. Just an empty stretch of road, no building, no pumps, no sign that anything had ever existed at this location. I was confused. I was certain I was at the right location. I checked my odometer, checked my landmarks, and verified my position. I was exactly where the truck stop should be. I decided that perhaps the truck stop had closed or been relocated. This happens sometimes on remote highways. I would just have to drive further south to the next refueling opportunity, which would be about 100 kilometers away. I could make it. My truck had enough fuel to get there without any problem. I continued driving, making a mental note to report the closed truck stop to the company later. But about 40 kilometers further south, I saw it again. Another truck stop right there on the road, just as it should be. I knew of this truck stop, a slightly larger facility than the one I'd been looking for before. I decided to pull in, refuel, and get some coffee. As I pulled off the road and into the parking lot, I looked around and noticed that the truck stop seemed slightly unusual. The building looked new, pristine, with no signs of wear or weathering. The pumps looked modern and clean. But something about the place felt off, though I couldn't quite identify what. I pulled up to one of the fuel pumps and started refueling my truck. I noticed that there were no other vehicles in the parking lot, which was unusual for a truck stop at this hour. Normally, there would be at least a few trucks parked, drivers inside getting coffee or using the restrooms, but this truck stop appeared to be completely empty. I finished refueling and went into the building. The interior was clean, well lit, and fully stocked with the kinds of supplies I'd expect to find at a truck stop. But there were no people, no one behind the counter, no one at the tables, no sounds of activity from anywhere. I walked deeper into the building, calling out to see if anyone was there. My voice echoed strangely in the empty space. I decided to wait a moment to see if someone might come out from a back room. But after 5 minutes of waiting, no one appeared. I returned to the counter and noticed something that made me stop. There was a logbook on the counter, the kind that truck stops sometimes keep for drivers to sign in. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with signatures and comments from various drivers over what appeared to be years. But when I examined the dates, I saw that they were all from January of 2025. There were no dates from any other time period, just January 2025 repeated over and over with different drivers signing in. My instinct told me that something was very wrong. I decided to leave the truck stop immediately. I went back outside and got into my truck, but when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the truck remained unresponsive. I checked my fuel level, and it showed that I had just filled up as expected. But the truck wouldn't start. I got out and looked around the truck stop. The place was still empty. There were no other vehicles, no people, no sounds of activity. I felt a creeping sense of dread starting to settle over me. I walked around to the front of the truck stop building and looked at the sign. The name of the truck stop was visible, but the letters seemed slightly blurry and hard to read, as if they were slightly out of focus or flickering. I decided to walk back inside and look more carefully at the logbook. When I examined it again, I noticed something that I'd missed before. Among all the signatures in the book, I recognized some names. I recognized the names of drivers who I knew, truckers who I'd seen on the road over the years. But the dates next to their names all said January 2025. I distinctly remembered seeing at least one of these drivers just recently, about a month ago in December. So how could they have signed this logbook in January? I looked at my own watch. It said the 21st of January. I looked at the calendar on the wall of the truck stop. It also said the 21st of January. So the date was correct. But I was starting to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, this truck stop, this situation. I walked back outside and tried my truck again. This time, the engine started immediately without any problem. I didn't hesitate. I pulled back onto the road and drove away as fast as I safely could. I didn't stop at the next truck stop. I drove past it without slowing down. I drove through the night, pushing myself, driving faster than I normally would, driven by a sense of desperation and fear that I couldn't quite rationalize. When I finally reached Fairbanks at around 3 in the morning, I drove straight to the dispatcher's office. I asked the dispatcher about the truck stop I'd visited, described its location and appearance. The dispatcher looked confused. He said there was no truck stop at that location. The next truck stop south of mile marker 150 was over 200 kilometers away, well beyond where I said I'd seen it. I insisted that I'd definitely seen a truck stop, had definitely filled up there, had spent time inside the building. The dispatcher offered to check my truck to see if there was fuel from the fill-up, but when they checked the tank, it was less than 3/4 full. Not the full tank that I remembered filling it to. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I only knew that I'd experienced something that didn't make logical sense, that didn't fit into the rational world. I couldn't convince anyone else that the truck stop existed. No other drivers reported seeing it. No records existed of such a location. But I knew what I'd seen, knew what I'd experienced, and I knew that there was something on that stretch of the Dalton Highway that defied explanation. I retired shortly after that incident. I moved to Vancouver and tried to leave the northern roads behind. But I never drove again, never took another job that involved travel. I spent my retirement quiet and contemplative, sometimes telling people about my experience, but more often choosing to remain silent. I know that there are places in the north that operate according to rules that don't match the rest of the world. Places where truck stops might exist for certain drivers at certain times, where logbooks might fill with signatures from people crossing through some kind of threshold or boundary that most people never encounter. I sometimes wonder if the other drivers whose names I saw in that logbook are still driving, still running into that truck stop, still trapped in that permanent January night. I wonder if they've noticed or if they've simply accepted it as part of the job. And I wonder most of all if the truck stop is still there, still waiting for the next driver who needs to stop and rest, still keeping its impossible records in its impossible logbook.